Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is about boosting resilience and how we can develop and cultivate this all-important characteristic in ourselves, particularly at this time when we most need it. We will review the component parts and how to focus on and strengthen each one. I chose for today, no surprise, the topic of boosting resilience. And for obvious reasons, I think that many of us have not felt that this was going to go on quite so long, and many of us, certainly me, had no idea what it was going to look like at this stage. So I kind of just started with this slide that I actually have sitting on my desktop, and it just is sort of a reminder that when you're feeling really super underwater or stressed, that it really feels like your anxieties have anxieties. So I think Charlie Brown may speak for us all, and that there's no dispute there. But the main question that I want to talk about today is how do we deal with this? So what about the present is so hard? I don't think I'm really telling you anything you don't know, but I think just to review it is helpful, because I think what we need to assess and really kind of take on board is that it's perfectly reasonable if we're feeling overwhelmed or if we're feeling that it's hard to cope sometimes. So I think one of the things that I want to focus on, and I want everybody to remember, is ours is a culture of mastery. We have, at any rate, often had an illusion of being in control. And I think it makes this time of a lack of control much harder as a result. So first, we've got this issue where, minimal control, there's just a lot of things that are in other people's hands, they're not in our hands, and we're unused to that situation. And one of the experts that I was reading about recently about anxiety, that he sort of said, well, the opposite of anxiety is not calm. The opposite of anxiety is having a plan. And I think that that's a lot of what's been taken away from people, or what people find, and certainly I find, sort of elusive at the moment. And I think that that becomes problematic. The second is the fact that we've got these moving goalposts. I think that first we're told that it's the scientists are going to come up with the answer, and then we're just waiting for the vaccines, but then there's different health advisories, and then there's a new variant, and then there's the next issue of, are you going to get your second vaccine, or how can you get your first? I think that there's a lot of things where we set on one and say, okay, that's what I'm going towards, and then it shifts, and that's very destabilizing. It's like our feet are on unsteady ground. There feels sometimes that there's no end in sight. I've got that tunnel just sort of going into the darkness there. And I think that a lot of people thought, well, beginning of 2021 was going to be super different. And instead it feels a lot more of the same, with snowstorms added to boot. Then I also just want you to remember, we've got this double down negativity bias. We talked about biases in one of the sessions before the summer. And that's that we have a sort of spiral where if it's positive, it reinforces itself, but if it's negative, it reinforces itself. And we have a bias that once we look at things through a certain lens, we continue to then notice those kind of things more often than we do the others. So if we're looking negatively, we'll see more negative things than we would otherwise. And the other way is just sort of looking at the kind of level of stress we have. There's one expert that talks about 3 categories of stress. There's what they call positive stress, which is the type that puts you on peak performance and allows you to be sort of on your mettle when you're running a race, making a speech, meeting somebody that's important to you. There's next level is what they call tolerable stress. It's more, and it's more debilitating, but it's something that you can be supported through. It's something that you can manage. And then there's what they call toxic stress. This is something where you're really having long-term changes in your brain development. You're having long-term changes in your responses to things. And what comes with that is an increased risk in physical and mental health outcomes. And this impact of stress on health and on development when it's kids, and on health and outcomes for us as adults, is something that I kind of want to focus on. And that's why on all of these webinars, I always talk about the self-care piece, because that's where it's most treatable, is really in your own habits. So one thing I want people to remember is how this pandemic is affecting you. It's not a moral victory or a failing. If you're doing well under it, it's not that, somehow you won the race. And if you're struggling or doing less well, that somehow there's a failure there. I think we each of us have different pasts and present experiences. We each of us have different triggers. And we're also born with different wiring and baseline capacities for and experiences with coping. So what I want to look at is what we can do to change the outcome going forward. There's a lot of research on resilience. There's a great book called Grit by Angela Duckworth. Brene Brown does a lot of work on resilience. And so there's some good data on the fact that it's something that we can impact ourselves, that it's not something that we're kind of landed with and we're just stuck with. It's something that we can kind of make a difference. So, but the question is sort of, where are you right now? Resilience gets a definition by Angela Duckworth as being a combination of goals or direction and grit or perseverance. So you need both the goals and the grit in order to have effective resilience. So where are you in this? You've got grit, but no goals, maybe. You know, it's like you feel that you're constantly kind of pushing at your most, but you're not really sure what you're heading towards. And every day is just a sort of slog of habits and putting one foot in front of the other. The next place you might be in is the feeling you have goals, but no grit. So it's like, you know where you want to be. You want to be in a calm place. Somebody used the term of accepting this with grace. Which I think is a very fine goal, but that they felt the lack of the grit. They felt that each day felt like it was climbing a mountain and was really hard. Possibly you're at the next stage where you feel you've got the grit, you've got the goals, you've been doing a lot of it, and you're just suffering from fatigue. Here we are 11 months on, and there doesn't seem to be light at the end of the tunnel, and you're just sort of exhausted with that. So the question is, how much is nature and how much is nurture? How much are you born with that you can't change? How much is something that you can impact? So the research shows that both grit and goals can be developed and cultivated. So that's something that I want to look at today. And I'm going to start to kind of break it down into the individual sections. There's going to be a lot of information, and I really want you to take what speaks to you today, maybe just land on one thing that you think is something you want to focus on, taking it kind of back home and thinking about it. But I thought I would lay it all out to try and just put it out there. I'll post some of the slides on Instagram in case any of you want to look over some of them again for some of the details, because as I say, there's sort of a lot here, but I just wanted to present it to you. This is what the research is showing, and kind of leave you to decide how you want to deal with it. So first, we'll look at the developing and defining of goals. The clear knowledge on this is that you need to be intentional and concrete. I mean, we can have this vague idea that we have our goals, we have our values, we know what it is that we think is important. But what's key and what's really important is that you write it down. Write it down, and that is then something that you can go back to. It's not set in stone, you can always change it, but it's there for you to review and to look at and think, well, does that work now? It worked when I first made that a month ago. Is that still true? And remind yourself of what the goals are. So the way I want you to do that is to sort of interview yourself. You're going to ask yourself questions. What do I want to learn this year? What do I want to accomplish? As Churchill said, never let a crisis go to waste. This year is a year of great loss, but it's also one of opportunity. So it needs a moment of reflection to see how we can make positive change in this otherwise terrible situation. Ask yourself, what can I do for myself? What can I do for my family? Ask, what can I do for others? It's a way of both looking inwards, but also looking outwards. And remembering, and I think we talked about this in a previous webinar, that the long-term effect of doing positive things for others has a greater sort of impact than it does necessarily doing it just for yourself. So I don't want you to forget the doing things for yourself, because I think the self-care piece is huge and it allows us to be able to engage in the rest of the world. But I just want you to keep both of those in mind, the internal, the external. So think about this as an opportunity and what you want to look at differently in this year. Make sure that you're looking at it close up and personal, very detailed. It's about you. What's right for somebody else isn't necessarily right for you. But also you need to take a wide angle. You need a more distant perspective. You need to be able to look at it from the distance. I want you to start with as long a list as comes to mind. Anything that you can think of, put it down. and then you pare it down. So start with everything, don't curate until you've got everything down on the paper, and then start to cut it down so that in the end, you can make the goals both manageable in number and manageable in scope. It's very important to be able to build up small successes by having small and manageable goals than to have this huge, long path that you feel that you're not making any progress on. So you'll want to have the short term and the long term so that you can have both. So let's look at something that's a little more complex than the development of goals, which is the characteristics that foster perseverance. There are 4 categories, and they're more complex and they're multiple incremental steps. So I'm going to start with just giving you the list of the 4, and then what I'm going to do is go through each one. So the first is cultivating awareness. There's something about cultivating that sense of self that is going to be very helpful. Develop tolerance of uncertainty and discomfort. Prioritize self-care habits. Enlist your team. You want to be both personal and specific. Like I said before, it's about you. What's right for somebody else might give you some inspiration. It might give you some ideas, but it really needs to be something that matches with your instincts, with your capacities, with your interests, and with the environment that you're in. It's obviously going to be very different for somebody who's living alone than somebody who's in a crowded household. So the steps are small and detailed to make this progress. And just as perseverance is about being dogged, so cultivating perseverance is about being dogged. So you might wonder then, is this a catch-22? Well, yes, in part it is, but the solution is to break each step down into incremental parts and focus on just one at a time. So let's look at each part of this individually. Cultivate self-awareness. Let's break that down. Know the boundaries between yourself and the external problems. You know, where does all the news about COVID end, and where do the details about you and your life start? Do they overlap? For sure they do, but they are distinct, and it's very important to make yourself separate from the sort of water you're swimming in so that you can see yourself as this individual, but you can also see yourself as part of the whole, both and. The next is know the limits of your own control. Don't rail at things you can't control. Look at impacting the things that you can. I think that there's a lot of the idea that there's no such thing as bad weather. It's the clothes that you decide to wear. It is true that you can't necessarily control a lot of the things that are happening to you, but you can control your response to it and how you're going to deal with it. So identify and manage expectations. What are your expectations? What are they now? What were they before? What are they now for the next few months? Are they reasonable? Really kind of check them against reality. If you think in your calm moments that they're not reasonable, then reset them and do that in a very intentional way. If you think they are reasonable, that's fine. Then just remind yourself that that is one possibility, but that there are, and this is going to be the next piece, that are possible other outcomes. Don't get wed to specific outcomes. It's very hard to deal with the disappointment when you are depending on something happening. So go through the exercise of imagining what would happen and what would it look like if your expectations didn't come to fruition. Take an example of trying to go away. Maybe you're trying to travel in May. So your expectations is that this all the travel advisories, all the travel bans are going to be over and that you can get out there. Let's hope you can. But I think it's important to go through the exercise of managing your own expectations here and not being wed to the specific outcome. So think about what would it look like? What will you do if indeed you can't go on that holiday in May, if indeed you or your child cannot get to college in the fall? There's one way of just really reviewing it and going through it that can instead manage your own expectations and make it easier when there are changes and when it doesn't come out exactly as you'd hoped. So understand how to distract yourself in a positive way. I think there's a lot of things that you just need to distract and have a reset. When you're really kind of in your own head and you're just sort of stuck ruminating over things, work out what it is. Is it going for a run? Is it listening to music? Is it trying to sit down and read a book? Maybe you haven't read a book in 6 months because you were so distracted, in which case pick up the phone and talk to somebody. But it's find out the ways that help you get out of your head in that moment. So the next section is the developing tolerance of uncertainty and discomfort. So here it's consider other points of view or interpretations, flexible thinking. I'm going to just jump ahead of one here. I love this cartoon, another one that you have, I have sitting around on my desktop. So it's the different points of view that lend themselves to very different meanings. You know, you've got the man on the desert island who sees somebody in the distance. It's like, oh my goodness, a boat, I'm about to be rescued. And now the second one, you've got the man in the boat, not any idea that this was a person needing to be rescued. It's like, finally, I found land. So I just want you to think about that in that we have very different points of view. People have very different points, and often discussing it can be very helpful in understanding how other people are seeing things and how they can be seen differently. The next part of the developing tolerance of uncertainty and discomfort is practicing acceptance. There are ebbs and flows, there's a constant change, there's a lot of not knowing. Try and avoid the absolute terminology that, of course, we're seeing a lot in the press. We're seeing a lot from our politicians. They're talking about crushing this virus. They're talking about kind of dominating over the situation. I think that in ways it's really easier to understand that there is vicissitudes, that there are going to be changes. And if you can kind of take that step back, I think that that's something that you will be able to do more easily. Understanding your own locus of control, what is and what isn't within it. That's what I was talking about when we were discussing the weather. No such thing as bad weather, just your choice of clothing. Really pick on the things that you can impact to try and put your energy in, and spend less time just being frustrated by all the things that maybe are in the government's hands or maybe in scientists' hands, and maybe just be sort of out there in more sort of societal hands that you can't impact so easily. Practice noticing instead of reacting. I know this sounds hard, and my first webinar was about reactivity and how quickly we can go there, particularly if we're triggered. And so we don't have that moment of thought. We're not in our frontal lobe where we're doing all our higher level thinking. We're often straight in the amygdala, which is the emotional response, the fight and the flight. So what I want you to do, if you can, is just practice this idea that when you hear something, you hear new news, you see new information, try and get used to delaying your reaction and just notice it. See what other thoughts appear at that moment. Maybe take the opportunity to describe it to yourself. So let's say you hear something about an opportunity of getting something that would make you more healthy. Maybe it's the vaccine. Maybe you hear about somebody being sick. Maybe it could be good news or bad news. But take a moment and describe it to yourself first. And then think about how somebody else might see it. And then start to think about, well, how do I want to react to that? What you're doing in this way is slowing down your responses and slowing down the way that you both take in information and react. And this allows you to stay more in your frontal lobes, in the executive functioning and in brain management part of your brain and your thinking. Embrace duality, easier said than done, of course, but think about both and as opposed to either or. Think about both hope as well as the reality of the situation. Think about when you're fearful that there's also things that could be grateful for. And so I think that start thinking in terms of less black and white, more of the gray area, and that will allow you to get into less catastrophic thinking and into sort of less of that catastrophizing down to what the worst possible scenario might be. You have a cognitive gaze. It's a choice of what you're going to focus on. It's easier sometimes for us than it is others, but you do have some control. And that goes back to what I was saying about work out what distracts you. What is the thing that can snap that close attention on something that may be negative and move yourself into something that is more positive and maybe slowing it down. Remember, all these things that seem difficult to do, some of them you may be doing anyway, others you may think that you need to really work on, but repetition develops your own neural pathways. It always becomes easier over time. It's like using a dumbbell for your bicep muscles. It's exactly the same when you're doing, emotional and sort of thought practice. You get better the more that you do it. And the place that it makes it easier to get better sometimes is making sure you're stepping up onto that balcony, the bird's eye view, you're looking down on it from distance, feel that you're less kind of wading around in the details, and you're more, from a bird's eye view where you can kind of see both the wood and the trees. The next characteristic is the self-care habits. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on that. We've talked about it a lot. I think we talked about it in a lot of previous webinars, more about putting it into practice. The eating well, sleeping well, and exercising is key, breathing and meditation. And I put that hand on the heart picture because I was reminded of something that I read the other day, that the act of physically putting your hand on the heart is vital to coming to a moment of peace. There's a network of neurons in the heart area. And when there's warmth and pressure on it, it actually calms the sympathetic nervous system. That's your kind of response system. And it reduces the fear centers in the brain. So just as in a moment when I would say breathe deeply and try and do it myself and certainly say it to others, there's also just this act of putting your hand on your heart and letting that warmth do its good there. Structure your day. Try and be as intentional as possible. Try and be as ordered. It tends to give you that sense of control, and that sense of control tends to push away those sort of fears of being a little overwhelmed or uncontrolled. And always, I say this every time, limit the news intake. Keep yourself up to date with what's happening, but you can do it once a day. Maybe you have a job where you need to do it all day, but then don't do it every day. Try and find your day off where you can really unplug. And I think every one of us would benefit from unplugging, turning your phone off, just turning the screen off and spending some time in the old analog world. Change it up. It's an individual preference, but some people do better with a comforting reliability of habits, always kept the same. Other people can really get a fillip of energy by a change in what they're doing. So, just think about how that impacts you. And then just a reminder, healthy habits pay big dividends. It's really worth spending your time in trying to work out which ones you can do and which ones you can do regularly. So the last one in this characteristics that foster perseverance is enlist your team. So not everyone in your team will fulfill every role, and you won't be able to fill every role for all of your friends either. So think about what you need, what you can offer, and who your go-to people are for each. I put down a couple of the areas or topics here. Who's the person you go to for a laugh? Who's the person that you go to help you reflect on how a situation went and how you might want to respond to it? Who do you go to just to kind of give you that pep talk, who's going to tell you, yes, you can do it, and just sort of keep at it? And then who do you go to for help? Who can you put your hand out to, reach out to, and just say, I really just need help with this. Can you kind of come in? So then once you've worked out who it is that you want to be connected to, reach out and make a habit of it. It's been a long time that a lot of us have been in some form of isolation or some form of restrictions. Some are in places where they can be much more open, but others are not. But even so, make it a ritual. Remember that rituals are habits with meaning. So text somebody. Maybe you send a text or an email once a day. You pick someone that you haven't been in touch with, or you pick someone who you know is living alone and might need a check-in. Maybe you're doing it once a week. You think of the pace that works for you, but try and make it regular. Don't worry if they're not replying. It's usually more about them than it is about you. But if you're worried about them, reach out again. If you think they're all right, then maybe reach out to someone else. Remember that if it's what you crave, there are ways of safely being with people. There's walking, there's eating out of doors. There's always the mask that you can ask other people to wear. You can wear yourself. There's testing. There's all kinds of ways to try and get you out in the world if that's something that you really feel you need to do. Others are more comfortable at home. But I think that you also need to be a little careful of that if you're somebody who finds it hard to go out, the fact that you may have spent 11 months not doing it, it's going to be really hard when we get to the end, or if not the end of this, to the new stage when you will be able to. It'll be really hard to overcome that kind of almost inertia and the fact that you're not used to it. Remember to make time and space for grieving. If you've suffered great loss, your timing and needs may be different. If other people are reaching out to you, just communicate to them that you need a little more time. Listen to yourself, but try not to hide away forever. When you're ready, reach out if you can. And the final thing is, and this is something we've discussed now for months, which is that COVID comfort levels are very different with different people, different families, different locations. Be aware of what your comfort level is. Be explicit about what your comfort level is. I think that putting out that information allows people to respond to it, to be explicit themselves. And I think that there is always a match out there. What do we do when we're stuck? So there's a moment when you're stuck, you feel that you're not really making any progress. It's a be your own detective moment. What's preventing me from achieving my goals? What thought or action gets me unstuck? What can I do to help me? What can I do to help others? And what can I ask others to do to help me? And finally, and I don't want to overplay it, but I equally don't want to underplay it, these are difficult times, and do I benefit from professional health, mental health support? Would I benefit from that? If you feel you would, reach out. There are professionals who are out there. Most people feel shy about it. There's a stigma that is felt still to be there. And obviously I'm on the other side of that. I believe very, very strongly that there is really important support out there and that it can be very effective. So if you think you need it, if you think somebody else needs it, please reach out and connect them, or find somebody who can help you connect them or connect yourself to a professional. But these are the questions to ask yourself, and just stop with each one individually. And as you stop with each one, see what answers you're coming up with. You are the expert on yourself, but often we don't give ourselves the time and the space to really review it. And that, I feel, is helpful. So be specific, make a plan. And I put at the end, share it, because I just find maybe I do things a little more effectively if I've fessed up to somebody else that that's my goal and that's what I want to do. And they keep me on it, or keep me at least responding as to whether I am on it or not. So a little silver lining here. There is a lot of research also on something called post-traumatic growth. So according to the research, there is at this upside that once you have come through or are going through adversity, there is potential not just for the resilience piece, which is bouncing back to where you were, but a potential for transformation. We can come out at the other end stronger in our self-esteem. We can come out with more authentic relationships that have really survived the test of this year, and maybe it's going to be several years of these struggles. We can come out with a greater appreciation of small things. We start to work on that gratitude piece and really understand that that is something that we can focus on in a very positive way. We develop, just by the nature of getting through it, a belief in our own ability to cope. And we can develop this growth mindset. We're less stuck in the way that we were, because we're not allowed to be stuck in the way that we were. These events, and this one, which is over so many months, which is what's so wearing, but these events that are traumatic events are also transforming events. So the winning combination to come out into a post-traumatic world of growth is that you are both realistic. We're not in any way suggesting that you will not be honest about how bad this year has been. It's not about being Pollyanna and pretending that it hasn't been bad or that it was better than it was. So it's a realistic assessment of the present or of the past, but it also involves hope for the future. So my last slide here is about nurturing hope. And that's something that, again, there is some work on how we can actually develop it. It's not just a place of where we are now. We can make that as part of our goal, to develop the hope piece and develop the ability to get into that frame of mind more easily when we find ourselves in a darker place. It takes consistent, intentional actions. And the first I want to look at is that regular reviewing and recommitting to the goals. Go back to that earlier idea of how we develop the goals and how we set them up, and review them, and then commit to them. And as you keep doing that, it allows you to reset some of your actions, reset some of your responses. Actively support yourself and others. I know this isn't a particularly COVID-friendly picture, but I found it irresistible. So if you're in a house, if you've got a pod, if you've got people who you can be very, physically close to and supportive, do that. If it's more distant, that works too. It really is about finding your team and really connecting with them and being your own support groups. Manage the perfectionism that many of us have and the absolutes. I always used to talk about using a yellow highlighter rather than a red pen. The red pen is critical. The yellow highlighter is really emphasizing what it is that you've done well and what it is that you want to do again. There are many things here. I want you to think about them, maybe review them. Pick one or two, that you want to do. Don't feel overwhelmed by it, but these are just ideas and suggestions of where you want to start in the transformation piece. There's the habit of reinforcing positive patterns of action and interaction. Again, it's slowing it down. It's thinking about an action that you did that had an outcome. It's thinking about an interaction you had with someone and what that outcome was, and really review it. Was there something negative? How could you do it differently? Was there something positive? In which case, how do you do that again? How do you make sure that that's there in your tools and coping mechanisms? Remind yourself what you're thankful for. The gratitude piece is absolutely huge. There's, again, a lot of research on this. It's immensely powerful. The research has shown that there's distinct improvement in mood and long-term improvement in those who keep a regular gratitude journal or those who take a moment each day to think of the several things that they're thankful for. So it's something that I would definitely encourage people to find a moment in each day to do, and maybe it's with someone else and maybe it's just on your own. And this overall sense of focusing on things that have gone well, again, it's not to deny the struggles, it's not to deny the loss and the grieving, but it is a way of being able to be in control of when you're ready and have time to grieve and to sit with the sadness, and when you, at other points in the day, you want to be able to be more positive and more focused on the hope. This one, it's a New Yorker cartoon. And I don't know how easy it is to see, but it's the calendar of January. And, there are certain days which is, cold and then gray and then wet. And then there's Arctic blast and ice storm and then slipping on the ice. And then on the 24th it says, why me, Lord? And then the 28th, it has weird frozen pellets. All these things that it just felt that January was never going to end, and then finally on the 31st, is his last day of January. Well, that was yesterday. What I want you to think about as you look at this is not just that Roz Chast is rather a brilliant cartoonist, as I think she is, but also the idea that, this too shall pass, and try and think of time as your friend, not as your enemy. In many ways, it's felt like our enemy because we've been locked in for long periods of time. We've been restricted for long periods of time. So it feels like we're kind of crossing the days off. In some ways, it's also our friend. It moves on inexorably, whatever we do. So things will change. There's no such thing as stasis. There will always be a change. So lastly, I just want to think about how overall we just looked at today about boosting resilience. Develop and regularly review your goals. Prioritize healthy habits and stay connected. Look both inward and outward and on the bright side. I put those little rose-tinted spectacles. They're not all bad. There's a good side to it. I understand about not wanting to overdo the rose-tinted part of it, but make it part of your practice of being able to control where you are in that process and daily and sort of minute by minute of where you want to be. Manage your expectations, manage others' expectations. Cultivate awareness of tolerance and uncertainty. And then where I like to end each of these is every day is a new day and a new opportunity to do things differently and better. And I hope you do believe that. I certainly believe that. I think that there's a lot of things that we can, each of us, take. And as I say, take the one that suits you. There's a lot of priorities here, and of course not everything can be prioritized, but I hope that in some way it's been helpful, and just looking at the very long evidence research is showing, and it's really putting us in the driver's seat in many ways, which I think will help us get through these next few months. So I want to thank you for listening to that. I hope this presentation has been helpful and that you'll find that you can make some small but beneficial changes to your habits and approach to each day. With these changes will come a consistent and reliable brightening, both day to day and to your overall outlook. Thank you for joining me today.